Roithmayr. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. This is Glenn Loury here at Brown University and the Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv, talking with Daria Roithmayr, who's professor of law at the University of Southern California. And we have the pleasure, at least I have the pleasure, of being able to talk with you about your new book, which is entitled Reproducing Racism. You have a subtitle, no?
Yes. How everyday choices lock in white advantage.
Who's the publisher?
NYU Press.
Aha, okay. So people out there in Blogging Heads land, be aware. This is a noteworthy book. I've had the pleasure of reading it and also of attending a conference at USC where the book was discussed. And I thought it was worth our time to just talk about it some here at Blogging Heads. So, Daria, why don't you take a moment to sort of set the conversation up by telling us a little bit of what you're trying to accomplish with the book?
Well, so I can tell you what I'm trying to accomplish, and then I'll give you a little nutshell version of what the book says.
Great.
What I'd really like to do, what I intended to do when I wrote the book, was to start a conversation about structural inequality. And by structural inequality, I mean inequality in jobs, housing, education, wealth. And this is a conversation that we haven't really been having much as it relates to race, even though we've been having a conversation about inequality more generally, which is new in the country. And so I really wanted, at some level, to restart the conversation, because it was a conversation that we were having at one point about racial inequalities and about racial discrimination and racism as it relates to those inequalities, and less about the kinds of intentional discrimination that we often talk about.
I'm
So
sorry.
the book,
Sorry to interrupt, but I mean, when you say we have a conversation, who are the we?
so the we is the conversation among members of the public, people who are
Okay.
very much aware of, because they're experiencing or are witness to or are victims of racial inequality, academics, activists, policymakers, a
Okay.
really wide range of people.
Okay.
It's meant to be a crossover book, as they say in the trade.
Very good. So you were saying.
So the book's argument centrally is that racial inequality persists even in the absence of intentional discrimination. So if intentional discrimination were to end tomorrow, racial inequality would persist indefinitely in the absence of some significant intervention, either by government or by civil society or by the market. And the book essentially borrows heavily from a range of literature on monopolies and antitrust law. And the argument really is one in which I claim that positive feedback loops, these processes that are self-reinforcing, are responsible for persistent inequality. So in the monopoly context, the quintessential monopolist that everyone loves to talk about is Microsoft. And so the story about Microsoft is that it engaged in bad behavior. It engaged in illegal bundling or tying, illegal contracts, and in so doing gained a small but important competitive advantage for Windows, the operating system that Microsoft manufactures.
Yeah.
And that small but important competitive advantage then began to snowball because of a relationship between software authors and consumers. Consumers wanted to buy the operating system with the widest range of software authors, and the software authors wanted to write software for the operating system that was attractive to the widest range of consumers. So every increase in software authors meant more consumers. Every increase in consumers meant more software authors. And this network effect, as they call it,
Yeah.
created a snowballing advantage, a self-reinforcing advantage. And that was even in the absence of ongoing innovation by Microsoft, but more importantly for us, even in the absence of ongoing bad behavior. So when the Department of Justice showed up, Microsoft could say, well, we stopped that a long time ago. And so hopefully you can see where the argument goes with regard to racial inequality. The idea here proceeds in three parts. In part one of the book, I talk about the way in which we can understand historical racial inequality during slavery and Jim Crow as cartel behavior, much like the cartels that we're used to thinking of in terms of the market, like oil cartels or diamond cartels or Microsoft as a cartel. There are important organizations in our racial history. So homeowners association, school boards, political parties, unions. These organizations operated to exclude on the basis of race, not for irrational reasons, but for competitive advantage. So for higher wages, better houses, more wealth. And they adopted many of the same tactics that cartels nowadays adopt. So there was violence, there was visits from cartel members to persuade people who had moved in the neighborhood that they didn't really want to live there. Racially restrictive covenants were spread, for example, by homeowners associations. And they worked really hard to exclude on the basis of race. In the second part of the book, I talk about the way in which this small but important, well, not so small, but important competitive advantage has now become, for whites, has now become self-reinforcing through a range of 4 different kinds of feedback loops, much like the feedback loop that I described with regard to Microsoft. Racial disparity has become self-reinforcing in the same way. So I talk about family wealth feedback loops in which parents give money to their children for down payments on a house or a college education. Neighborhood feedback loops in which public schools are financed on the basis of local property wealth. And so children who graduate from well-financed public schools go on to live in neighborhoods that can finance good public schools and so on. The third kind of feedback loop that I discuss is the social feedback loop, social network feedback loop, in which people of color are part of social networks that are more likely to contain people who are under or unemployed, who are working to the extent that they are in low-wage jobs with little opportunity for advancement, where whites are more likely to have in their social networks people who are working at high-wage jobs with a lot of opportunity for advancement. And the structure of those networks is actually different as well. And then finally, I talk about institutional feedback loops, in which for many of these institutions that we've been discussing, whites were the first to occupy those institutions. And not surprisingly, they've chosen rules for succession, admissions policies for higher education, or hiring criteria for employment that end up favoring people who look very much like them, and in particular, people who are white. And in the business, they call it the first mover advantage. So institutional feedback loops reproduce the first mover advantage. And then in the third part of the book, I explore some potential remedies, policy prescriptions, but maybe more general ideas about how to dismantle these feedback loops. And I reiterate the argument that even in the absence of ongoing discrimination, unless those feedback loops are dismantled, we're likely to look at persistent gaps in wealth, in housing, in education, and employment for a long time to come.
Okay, let me ask you some questions about this interesting account, which is not unfamiliar to me since it's
Yes.
parallel.
Yes, so we should remind your listeners that this book owes a great intellectual debt to you. Your earliest work is in some ways the intellectual forefather, progenitor of this account, because you were among the first to talk about the importance of looking at social capital and social networks to explain contemporary outcomes.
Very generous of you to say. I want listeners to know that you're referring to work that comes out of my PhD dissertation at MIT in economics, 1976. I repeat, 1976. Right? That was a long time ago. In which I offered some speculations not dissimilar to some parts of what it is that you were just talking about in terms of feedbacks. And I've made similar arguments in subsequent work. But yeah, I've trod similar ground. But I want to ask some questions. So You use the phrase "people of color," and we're talking about race with inverted commas here. And I wonder exactly what we're talking about when we use those terms. Does that include Latinos? Does it include Asians? Does it include people of African descent who may be first or second generation migrants from the Caribbean or from Africa itself? How is it that whites come to constitute a group when people who are, quote, white are of a diverse set of social backgrounds and social histories? Could you speak a little bit to this categorization that you're seemingly taking for granted, but that one might regard as in need of some kind of an account, even before we get to talking about the nature and the causes of inequality? Where do these groups come from? Why are they, principles in an argument like this? Why are they rightly taken to be principles in an argument such as the one you're making?
So it's an excellent question, and I think in many ways the answer to the question comes from the processes themselves, because this is a deeply history-dependent kind of argument. And so when I speak of people of color, I'm talking in many ways about several different stories. Stories about African Americans, stories about Latinos, stories about some Asian groups that involve cartel-like behavior that takes a particular form and is of a particular intensity. So just to focus on African Americans, for example, the stories that I tell, and the stories that I tell in the book are predominantly about African American, but not exclusively, are stories in which you can trace this cartel behavior and then identify the specific feedback loops. For Latinos, for example, the story is a slightly different one. But there are stories, for example, in California, racial exclusion on the basis of race kept Latinos, Mexicans out of California public schools. Latinos were frequently segregated in company towns when they were growers. For example, school boards acted as cartels to exclude until the famous Supreme Court case in which the Supreme Court decided that desegregation rules apply to Latinos as well. And so there are a range of stories, but the key is to be able to identify the cartel behavior and then to identify on top of that self-reinforcing processes that go on to reproduce inequality. And a lot of people will ask the question, well, isn't this a story that you could tell about Jews or about the Irish, white ethnics? And for a certain amount of time it is, but there are significant differences. So, for example, white ethnics were included very importantly in the move to the suburbs where the federal government excluded on the basis of race. So there was redlining in which the federal government refused to lend money to blacks and to Latinos and to some Asian groups, but included those white ethnics. And because home ownership is such an important part of wealth, those white ethnics were able to benefit from that kind of governmental exclusion in a way that the other groups that I've been talking about were not. By the same token, Jews were also segregated, but not to the same degree and not for as long as African Americans and now Latinos are being excluded in terms of residential segregation. So it's a very history-specific kind of argument, and the history really is what helps us to understand why there are some commonalities between white ethnics and communities of color, immigrant communities in particular, but that those are qualitatively different. Of course, slavery puts a whole other gloss on the story for African Americans with regard to wealth, for example.
Sure.
But the stories are qualitatively different for white ethnics, the groups that we've been discussing, than they are for Blacks, Latinos, and some Asian groups.
Well, forgive me for pushing on this, but I'm not sure you entirely answered my question, because these groups are themselves very heterogeneous. So African Americans as a group are very heterogeneous. Witness the distinction between, as I was mentioning, first or second generation immigrants from other countries.
No, that's right.
Who may be
so
of
I'm
African
talking
descent.
predominantly about descendants of slaves, but the research shows that depending on the immigrant group, first generation African immigrants are sometimes folded in, again, depending on the group. And I don't know if you had a chance to read, I wrote a book review of Amy Chu and Jed Rubenfeld's book, Triple Package, in which I talked specifically about the experience of Nigerians, for example, who have a very different history, a very different migration pattern, and there's a very different story to tell with regard to, for example, their historical origin, their immigration story, and then the kind of outcome that you see with regard to those groups than the story that you can tell for the descendants of slaves.
No, I didn't have a chance yet to read the review, but I still haven't quite yet posed my question or my concern, which is that, what is a group? What defines the boundaries of a group? There's something that might be a little imprecise and a little unrigorous about just adopting the sort of common sense, ordinary language use of these terms when we're making this kind of social analysis, when there might be, you can distinguish between Nigerians and Ghanaians and Jamaicans, but we're still kind of engaged in this categorization of large numbers of people who have very different particular circumstances.
Well, so I would say that departing from the common usage, the what I'm talking about, and this is actually the way that I tend to think of the importance of race. Race is a marker for historical experience. And so to the extent that these groups shared a common history, a common set of experiences, those groups are useful, even if they are somewhat imprecise, but they are useful for standing in as proxies for a common set of historical experiences that, as I've explained, differ from group to group. Couldn't
these feedback loops also apply to whites? I mean, I don't understand why wealth transfer within a family that benefits the children of someone who's accumulated a fair amount of wealth wouldn't be a correct observation to make about white families, some of whom bequeath wealth.
Absolutely,
some of whom
because
did not.
those are mostly class feedback loops, right? But those class feedback loops are set against a history of cartel behavior in the case of the groups that I was mentioning, and a slightly different and less intense story with regard to cartel behavior for white ethnics. So absolutely, feedback loops operate across the board because they're by and large class processes. But what distinguishes communities of color from white ethnics are the different histories that I was discussing. So they're separable in terms of part one being the cartel story, part two being the feedback loop story, and the feedback loops definitely operate in much the same way and probably explain a great deal of class inequality among whites.
Well, maybe
the difference is in the historical cartel behavior.
Maybe we should move on to something else, but I'm still, communities of color. I mean, Latinos, right? So you've got recent immigrants, you've got people who descended to 3-4 generations, you've got people who are from Iberian Peninsula, you've got people who are from Guatemala and Nicaragua.
So I focus mostly on Mexicans.
Okay.
Those are the historical. That's the historical cartel behavior that I look most at.
Okay, one might simply have said.
I think this would end up mattering if it mattered to you, perhaps, in terms of remedy. So maybe we can revisit the question when we talk again about remedy.
Okay, and you understand, my job here is to be critical to a certain degree, so as to make this an interesting conversation. What about cartel behavior?
Absolutely.
When I was taking economics as an undergraduate, they taught me that cartels were difficult things. Monopolies, easy to understand, right? You got Microsoft, they have a unified corporate strategy, they maximizing their profits. Cartels a little bit more tricky because their interests are not completely aligned, and there may be an incentive for particular cartel members to deviate from the strategy that the cartel pronounces as in its own interest. Now, if I take a cartel to consist of a race of people, if I start talking about racial cartels, now I have to talk about how it is that I keep everybody on the same page when I've got hundreds of thousands or millions of people to reckon with.
So I don't think of an entire race as a cartel. I think of individual organizations like the Homeowners Association as a cartel. So They're racial cartels to the extent that they're excluding on the basis of race, but the cartel doesn't include all whites for all time. They're historically specific and organizationally discrete, and so even so, you're absolutely right. The economist's objection to cartel stability still is one that I have to answer. Although I would point out that according to economists, cartels are never stable, and history certainly seems to bear that out as a misguided idea. There are plenty of long-standing diamond cartels, oil cartels, among others. But the story that I tell in the book to answer the stability question is one in which I look at two major sources of cartel stability or stabilization to keep those people with heterogeneous interests on the same page. One is the use of law. So the restrictive covenant is in many ways a legal mechanism that keeps white homeowners who may be tempted to break ranks and sell across racial lines in Chicago at the relevant time period. And the white homeowner understands when he or she signs the racially restrictive covenant that she subjects herself to a lawsuit by other members of the neighborhood if she does that. And so law in the form of restrictive covenants, in the form of segregation ordinances, in the form of legal agreements between employers and employees in terms of whether they're going to hire whites exclusively. Law becomes a very important way of, in some sense, spreading the cost of cartel enforcement among taxpayers because courts were enforcing these racially restrictive covenants. So that's one way in which racial cartels help to stabilize themselves.
But
Another way,
those laws haven't been valid for 60 years or so. Restrictive covenants were struck down in the 40s, were they not?
Right, in 1948. And the cartel story that I'm telling is a historical story. I'm not arguing, although some have pushed me to, that cartels are still very much alive and well and operating in the same way, because I don't think they are. Part one of the book is a historical story, but it isn't necessarily a contemporary story. So for the period of slavery and Jim Crow in which those laws were being used, we can characterize that history as cartel behavior. And I think the story is very different after the laws change, but I'm focusing mostly on history. And then the second, so beyond law, the second stabilization mechanism that I discuss in the book is social norms, and social norms of guilt and shame that are focused on identity. So there's this fantastic book by Rose Helper in 1969, a sociologist who interviews white real estate brokers in Chicago and other cities of the North who refused to sell across racial lines, even when it was in their economic interest to do so.
Yeah.
A big economic interest, because they had a lot of money coming to them if they were willing to bust blocks. And their answers were fascinating. First, they pointed out the fact that they would be blacklisted. They would be cut off from their banks, from their listing services, from their customers, who would blacklist them if they crossed racial lines. But second, they talked about their own internal guilt, their guilt at the possibility of uprooting white families who had lived in neighborhoods for decades, and those social norms, collective action, not just in the way of law, but in terms of social norms, did a lot of work to keep people on the same page, even when it would have been in their economic interest to break ranks.
I see. Let me talk to you for a minute then about, you mentioned this along the way, one of the institutional feedback mechanisms. You said institutions of higher education choose rules for selecting that are somehow or another, biased in favor of or designed to reproduce the racial composition of the institution. How is it that relying on test scores and your grade transcript and letters of recommendation and the other criteria that colleges use somehow disadvantageous to African Americans or privileging people who, quote, look like those who were already in these institutions.
So with regard to admissions criteria, for example, in higher education, first, it's important to just for context, take a look at the history. So there's been a fair amount written about the way in which colleges dealt with the influx of both Jews and blacks into higher education when they weren't quite so coy about what it was that they thought was happening. And it was precisely because, for example, Jews were being admitted in larger and larger numbers on the criteria that schools had announced as the relevant criteria, largely grades and test scores, that colleges began to admit now on a wider range of criteria, including not just grades and test scores, but leadership skills, sports participation. And the focus was announced in the Ivy Leagues, at least, that they really wanted to train not the quote-unquote greasy grind, the person who had his nose in the books and studied all the time, but rather captains of industry, the well-rounded man. And so there was a much wider range of criteria that was considered, and in fact, there were quotas in some of the Ivy Leagues where neither Jews nor African Americans were admitted for a large period of time. And mind you, no one understood this to be explicitly racist. They really understood themselves to be focusing the mission of higher education in good faith on a certain kind of student and not another kind of student, because they thought that was the better use of university learning.
Yeah.
In contemporary times, so that's the historical context.
Yeah,
in
but
contemporary times,
I want to ask you something about that, if I can.
Well, okay, but let me go ahead and answer your question more directly, if I can, and then we can go back to that. I think with regard to contemporary admissions criteria, let's take law schools, for example. It's no secret that African Americans, Latinos, scoring over 160 are very few and far between, and there's great competition for that small number. But the majority of law school applicants don't achieve those kinds of scores for all kinds of complicated reasons, one of which is stereotype threat. But even putting that aside, the difficulties with regard to attending public schools, for example, in family wealth, reproduce themselves and express themselves in those lower test scores. So using GPA and test score in many ways recaptures a lot of the other kinds of feedback loops that I discuss in the book.
Okay, what I was going to ask about the first half of your response was Jews and African Americans. I mean, that seems a strange construction to me about the early 20th century, which, if I'm not mistaken, is when this concern about the Ivies being flooded by Jews became a major concern, and the institutions changed, and I'm aware of this history, changed their criteria to emphasize more than merely academic achievement. I would not have, I'm an African American and proud of it, but it wouldn't have been my first instinct to say Jews and African Americans, because I wouldn't have thought that there were nearly so many African Americans in that particular historical period as there had been Jews who were knocking down the doors of these institutions.
Well, so the story about Jews is a story that I tell to illustrate the point that admissions criteria can reproduce the admission of people who are first to occupy the institution. African Americans were actually excluded just flat out until in different time periods. And so there wasn't even the need to use admissions criteria. You just said that they weren't admitted. But the point that I was making with regard to Jews was to show the way in which admissions criteria, again, in good faith by many university administrators, end up reproducing the admission of those who were first to occupy the institution.
Yeah, I guess the question is, or maybe the criticism is, whether or not the analogy that's being drawn by that illustration is apt in reference to African Americans even today.
So the argument is that we want now we're ready to focus on the quote unquote greasy grind scholar. Now we want to emphasize meritocracy. Although I will note for the record that the Ivy Leagues are still conducting interviews. They're still emphasizing captains of industry kinds of criteria, and they're still admitting legacy admits in much the same way as they were before. There's less of an emphasis, but the categories that the Ivy Leagues were using to screen admissions, in which they gave B for the Boondocks kid who came from Appalachia and A for the all-around, those were in use until the late 1970s, early 1980s. So things didn't change as quickly as I think you're suggesting that they might have.
Okay,
but I think,
fair enough. But I mean, the argument has shifted a little bit. I mean, because you say about law school admissions and the LSAT and the 160 threshold and the relatively few blacks above it, and all the schools competing to try to attract them. You say stereotype threat. You're going to explain now why it is that relatively few blacks are exceeding this criterion, which is a rather different argument, and it well may be right. It well may be right that some of these dynamic processes that accumulate disadvantage for African Americans are implicated in the relatively low number of African Americans
absolutely.
who present.
I don't think there's any question that that's true.
Okay,
Otherwise,
then let
how
me
do you
stipulate
explain
that while I'm on my way to saying that's a different set of considerations altogether from ascribing to the institutions, whether tacitly or explicitly, some motivation in hewing to a 160 cutoff or whatever it might be, that is about reproducing the advantage of the group that's already there. I mean,
Well, remember I said before that I thought administrators were operating in good faith, that they weren't saying to themselves, although some were, but most of them weren't saying to themselves, we really would like to keep Jews out. Instead, they were talking about more the institutional mission and doing so in a way that was either oblivious to or insensitive to or in some sense benefiting from, if that was a side benefit, the exclusion of a particular group of people. And I think the same is true now. That is that in focusing on grades and test scores, in addition, in many states, completely unable to take into account historical disadvantage because of race, institutions of higher learning are focusing on a mission that given the criteria that they've adopted, excludes particular groups of people that were not the first movers. Imagine this. Imagine if, imagine whites adopting a set of criteria that disproportionately admitted Latinos, blacks, and some Asian groups. The idea is that it's possible for white administrators to focus on the mission, even though focusing on that mission excludes particular groups because of either historical disadvantage or stereotype threat, which we can talk about in a second. The first mover. It's all I'm saying is it's not a coincidence that the criteria continues to admit in disproportionate numbers the first mover, and is insensitive to, if not creating the mission on the backs of those groups which it excludes.
And what I'm saying is that if I wanted to test the hypothesis that the choice of criteria, whether, again, consciously or tacitly, was exclusionary of, let's say, African Americans, one of the first things I'd ask is, do those criteria correlate at all with the post-admissions performance of the people who come into the institutions? And one of the things that I would presumably have to reckon with, is the, on my understanding of the data that are available, relatively poor performance at elite institutions of legal education. We're talking about law schools now, of African Americans who are admitted to those institutions with the LSAT tests and other criteria of admission that are decidedly inferior to those of the whites who are being admitted. So what do you have to say about that?
So first, I think you're referring to Rick Sanders' work, which has been roundly criticized and quite effectively, in my view, discredited, given the kinds of methodological problems that he had with regard to his research. But more than that, I think the question of performance is an important one. When you look at the correlation coefficients between the LSAT and people's performance, either in law school or as lawyers, it's actually a pretty poor correlation. So LSAT correlates well to first semester, first year grades. That's first semester, not second semester, not first year overall, not the full 3 years of law school, but first semester, first year grades, and then the correlation is still a pretty weak one. Most administrators admit that the LSAT is a poor predictor, but they don't have anything that's any better. And so if you're going to defend the criteria on the basis of some correlation to performance, then you need to look also not just to law school, but to actual performance as lawyers when you get out. And there, the research seems pretty clear that there's not enough of a correlation to defend the criteria on those grounds.
Yeah, I don't know much about the literature on post school performance. Let me just say on with regard to Sanders, I wasn't embracing Sanders' arguments to court. I was pointing to the data. So as I understand Sanders, the argument is that African American students on a counterfactual, were they not to be admitted to the elite institutions, would do better if they were reassigned someplace else because they'd be better matched. And people criticize that. But the simple description of what is the grade performance of African American students at these institutions when they are admitted under affirmative action would seem to me to be just a tabulation of the data. And Sanders or anybody else looking at the same data is going to get the same answer. Yeah.
I'm not aware of any research that actually looks at performance in law school over all 3 years and breaks it down racially. Sanders' data mostly has to do with bar passage rates, and that's where he hangs his hat.
I think first year law school GPA is also one of the things that he's reporting on there. But be that as it may, the question, it seems to me, is not how closely does the LSAT correlate with X, where X could be first year law school grades or it could be the cumulative average over the 3 years. The question is there anything other than the LSAT that correlates better with those things, since the decision maker has to make an estimate of how a person is going to do based on the evidence that's available. So a relatively weak correlation doesn't end the argument. It's compared to what?
Well, but so then it goes back to the question that we were discussing earlier, which is when the criteria reproduce the relative success of the group that was first to occupy the institution, and that criteria is weakly correlated, even in the absence of anything better, one can say that there are racial effects with regard to the criteria, and that the disparities in admission rates will reproduce themselves even in the absence of ongoing intentional discrimination. And that's really all I want to get out of that description, that there are first mover advantages in terms of institutional occupation, that those first mover advantages reproduce themselves. And I'm fairly confident in saying that if the LSAT and GPA predictive index method were all of a sudden to start disproportionately excluding whites, then institutions would move pretty quickly to find something to either develop a better predictive index. I mean, that's one of the points to make, is that given who the first movers were and who are the administrators actually choosing whether to adopt these criteria, no one's working all that hard on developing something that's a better predictor and less racially excluding. There's no research that I'm aware of that's being done on that at all. Okay. Not even by the AALS.
Yeah, I can't contradict you on that, but I can say this. If everybody in the world were white, it would still be necessary to select whom to admit to a law school. That would be a big problem. So the notion that the institutions don't have an interest in finding, more effective ways of anticipating who's going to be successful in their institution doesn't seem right to me, because that's a first order problem, regardless of the disparity of admissions rates across racial groups. I mean,
Well, so
in other words,
you
how would you decide amongst the applicants to USC whom to admit if everybody was white? How would you choose them? You would have to have some criteria.
Well, back in the
Presumably,
day,
you wouldn't.
everyone who applied was admitted. So before the early 1900s, they just admitted when everyone was white and male. They admitted everybody who applied, and then they adopted these standardized tests right around the same time that the eugenics movement came into full fruition. And many thought that those standardized tests were adopted in large part so that they could justify, for example, making all Army officers white and people of color had to serve in the enlisted ranks. So those standardized tests themselves have a terrible history, as you probably know. But your point is well taken that at some point you have to come up with ways to decide who's going to be in and who's going to be out. If it were up to me, I would do lottery, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. You know, law schools educate on the basis of predictive index largely to preserve their own reputation as an elite institution. And I'm of the view that the quality of the education that you get shouldn't necessarily be correlated to the quality of the student. That is, the faculty of the most elite institutions should be responsible for educating those who scored the lowest in the predictive index category so that we could get a more equal distribution of legal education. The point is that those institutional arrangements work the way that they do for reasons of elitism and for reasons that end up reproducing racial disparity.
I can think of some other reasons, like there are complementarities between having a lot of smart people in the same room. They learn from each other as well as from the instruction that's being given. I've got 1,000 applicants and I've got 100 seats. I want to try to get 100 smart people, quote unquote, into the room together. And so I search for ways to try to sort amongst those 1,000 applicants who are the smartest ones. Not because I'm only interested in preserving my institution's reputation. Of course, I am so interested, but because I also know that the quality of the product that I'm producing will be enhanced to the extent that I can effectively select, not by lot, but by whatever, indicators of post-admissions performance are available to me, the students who are going to be most helpful in educating each other and creating an environment that'll make my institution someplace that other smart people in future years want to attend. What's wrong with that argument?
Actually, the research shows quite the opposite, that with a heterogeneous mix, everyone does better. And that's because the smarter students learn a lot themselves from teaching the weaker students, and the weaker students learn a lot from being taught by the smarter students. And that kind of teaching doesn't happen when everybody's as smart as everybody else. The same is true with regard to economic mixes. So mixed neighborhoods economically do better than economically segregated neighborhoods when you look at the welfare of everyone involved. So I do think that it is mostly the elitism of the institutions. But again, I don't want to push the point too far. I take your point, but my larger point still stands, which is even though there might be good reason to sort people, even though there may be no better way of sorting people, the fact is that first movers still benefit from those admissions criteria, and the same folks who were being excluded by cartel behavior when those criteria were first adopted are being excluded, and that doesn't look like it's going to change.
Okay, let's talk about remedies. We got a little time left. No, I'm not convinced, and I'm particularly not convinced about this research, which I would like to see, that asserts that heterogeneity is better for all concerned in the classroom. I think that's got to be context specific. Maybe it's true.
And it's heterogeneity within a certain band.
It would have to be that,
saying,
but even so. But be that as it may,
I'll send it to you.
I want to put before you the idea that racial wrongs don't necessarily necessitate racial remedies, and that the feedback processes that you've described, to the extent that they are historically an accurate account of how we got to where we are, may not tell us very much about how to get to a better place, and in particular, that a class-oriented remedial strategy, not only as a political matter but as a practical sort of functional matter, might be the best way of thinking about how to reduce inequality, including racial inequality, even if one can persuasively demonstrate that the extent of racial inequality owes a lot to the history of feedback processes.
I might very much agree with you there. So when you came to USC, we talked about baby bonds, and so to fill your listeners in, baby bonds are the idea that you can create a children's trust fund, and they actually did this in the UK for a little while, where every child who was born got 500 pounds at birth, 700 pounds if they were needy, and then another 500 or 700 pounds at the age of 7. And that money was invested. Parents could match. The government matched parents matching. But that money couldn't be touched until the child was 18. And then the child could withdraw the money only for education, for retirement, or for a housing purchase. And in some sense, the idea was that you create the kind of advantage that wealthier families are able to give to their kids privately. And I tend to think that a remedy like that, to the extent that it created the kind of self-reinforcing advantage for low-wealth families, would be politically much more sellable if you means tested for the wealth of the family. And practically speaking, because wealth is so dramatically disparate with regard to race. I mean, I don't think most people are aware that blacks and Latinos earn 7 and 8 cents on the dollar. We're not talking 70 or 80%, 7 or 8 cents on the dollar of wealth accumulation. And I think that if you were to means test for family wealth with regard to something like baby bonds, that you would capture the families of color who are still disproportionately low wealth. You would exclude Sasha and Malia as the representatives of African American families with wealth. And you would include a lot of low-wealth white families as well, who are in many ways suffering, not for the same reasons, not with the same cartel story to explain the genesis of their low wealth. And then the other thing that would happen is politically, as you pointed out, it's not just sellable, it's a way of creating a cross-race coalition. I can imagine poor and working-class whites being very much in favor of something like baby bonds.
Let me just remark. These wealth comparisons by groups are notoriously difficult because of so many zeros. There's just a lot of people who don't have any wealth whatsoever. Undoubtedly, the number you were citing was a median. The median,
that's right.
The person who's at the 50th percentile has 8 cents relative to the dollar of the white person who's at the 50th percentile. And that's you right. Just have to be careful about that. But the other thing I want to say here, this is not about wealth at all. This is maybe changing the subject a little bit. It's about what a deep remedy would be. Okay, so one thing you can do is indemnify people at the bottom against kind of perpetuating across the generations their relatively low economic social status. And you could do that for everybody, not just for people of color. And the baby bonds is one attempt to do that. But another thing that you could do, it seems to me, or I want to know how you react to this, is think about undermining the very categorical distinctions that give rise to people of color on the one hand, quote unquote, and whites on the other. That is, subvert racial distinction altogether. That is, rather than buying the historical inheritance of racial differentiation in our politics and our everyday life and so forth, working actively against it. I don't simply mean promoting intermarriage and, suddenly racial distinctions will disappear. Although that would be one aspect of what one over a longer term might envision to be a transformation of the social landscape that reduced the significance of race. But I do mean in our own conceptualization and in our own advocacy, not so reflexively and with such dependency, relying upon what are, after all, I think, morally questionable categorical distinctions. I mean, ones that we probably should, in our modern, 21st century posture, be skeptical of. And I wonder what you'd say about that.
Well, so I have 2 or 3 reactions. One is, I think that those categorical distinctions make a big difference if what you think is going on is intentional discrimination on the basis of racial category, contemporary intentional discrimination. And the story that I'm telling isn't really that. Having said that, I would say, secondly, that the notion of integrating as a way of integrating feedback loops, so intermarriage, for example, to seize upon the point that you were making earlier, would be one way, to the extent that people could get past racial categories, if we could integrate our schools, integrate our neighborhoods, integrate our families, that in many ways those self-reinforcing feedback loops would dissolve, even if you think that folks are have, for example, social networks that are racially disparate, not because they're racist, but just because of the psychologist's maxim that birds of a feather flock together. And I would consider that a real positive if I thought it were possible, if I thought that we were able to get past racial categories in our family networks, in our neighborhood networks, in our social networks. I just don't see that happening. And then the third answer that I'll give you is, in many ways, perhaps the reason that I don't see that happening, which is that people attach a great deal of meaning. Affiliative identity is a source of great meaning, particularly for those who are in a relatively disadvantaged position. And I understand how, I very much understand and very conscious of in the conversation talking to you about this, that there's an argument to be made that that's to, for example, Latinos' disadvantage to continue to hold on to the Latino identity and not to try to integrate. But there's a real sense of loss if the price for integrating wealth feedback loops is losing what makes being Latino, being Mexican distinctive.
Yeah.
It's in some sense a different form of it's a different price that now has, it's a double price that has to be paid. So first you were deprived of wealth on the basis of your race, and now you're being asked to sacrifice those deep affiliative connections that have given your life and your identity so much meaning. When you ask people of color to describe themselves, when you ask women, for that matter, to describe themselves, they'll choose the word woman or Mexican or African American in the first two or three words that they're choosing to describe themselves in a way that isn't true, for example, for wealthy white men, because they don't think of themselves in those categories. And I'm very leery of anything that asks of a group that's already disadvantaged materially to sacrifice those sources of cultural meaning.
But it may be that you can't have one's cake and eat it too. That is, if you want equality, it may be that assimilation / integration is an essential component of what it takes to get there. It can't be a new story that outside groups have had to pay a price of surrendering some of the psychological assets that allowed them to manage their outsiderness status as they move from being outsiders to insiders. That's got to be.
I think that's right.
Yeah, that's got to be a perennial of social life.
I think that's true, but I just don't think it's going to happen. I don't think it's realistic. It hasn't happened yet. There doesn't seem to be any way to get from here to there, and it's it's a coordination problem. I'll stop being Mexican if you stop calling yourself Black. I just don't think it's going to happen.
Well, let me. I hear you, and I certainly don't contradict the surmise that you've just drawn. That's consistent with my own observation. But I want to give an example of something that I think maybe is relevant here, and that's about voting and about the drawing of voting districts and about the representation of populations of color in various legislative bodies. I'm sure you're aware of this recent case coming out, I believe, of Alabama, in which some African-American plaintiffs, if I'm not mistaken, are suing to object to the reapportionment of state legislative districts in the state, based upon the fact that they believe that the Republican legislature, which affected the reapportionment, were crowding African Americans too much so into, quote, Black majority districts, majority minority district. I don't even know how to say it, but you know what I'm saying.
Right. I know what you're talking about.
And in such a way, making the rest of the districts that didn't have African American voters in it because of the reapportionment whiter, more conservative, and more Republican. And they were objecting to that. They were saying, we want Black districts, but we don't want them as Black as this legislature has drawn them, because there are enough Black people to get us both the Black districts and to have some left over to kind of leaven the conservative orientation of some of the other districts that might change the composition of the legislature. And I couldn't help but find that to be profoundly ironic and suggestive to me of the idea that maybe we've gone way too far. I know I'm changing the subject from your book, but I want you to respond to this. Way too far down the line of thinking that in order to have effective political representation, a person has to be of the same racial group as somebody else. Now, this is locked into our law and it's locked into our political practice in a very deep way. And that's the kind of thing that I'm saying, can't we begin to think about maybe that's, it had its time, but this ain't 1965 anymore. And maybe we can walk back from that a little bit. I, again, ask you to respond to that.
Well, so I think it's very difficult to parse race and politics whenever it comes to voter reapportionment or voting rights litigation of any kind. And that's because you see a lot of reapportionment on the basis of race because, for example, officials are aware that blacks tend to vote Democrat. So they're making what are essentially racial decisions, but they're making those decisions because of the way in which those voters tend to vote for political purposes.
Yeah.
And by the same token, I'd be willing to bet that what's really behind the plaintiff's complaint in the Alabama case is the political point and not the identity point, which is that this leavening argument is an argument not that we want to keep those districts racially leavened, but we want to keep them politically leavened.
Yeah.
And here again, you see the very difficult task of trying to parse identity from political tendency. And so I again, to go back to an argument I made earlier, I tend to think of race in those contexts. I tend to think of race as functioning in a couple of ways. One of which is, and I teach this to my critical race theory students, that there are different kinds of race, if you want to think about it this way. That there's cultural race, in which we talk about those deep affiliative identities that we were just discussing. There's also historical race, in which we talk about the experience of cartel behavior. And then I think of, in many ways, historical race as giving rise to a form of, say, political race, in which there is a connection between racial identity and voting pattern, not for cultural reasons, but for historical reasons, in terms of, and I think most voters at least take their initial political inclinations from their parents and their surrounding community. So the tendency to vote Democrat gets passed down in the same way that family wealth does. So I think that race qua race really doesn't mean much. In fact, I might even agree with Scalia in that way. It's skin color, but what it ends up being a proxy for is a set of historical experiences and a set of cultural affiliations that come from group connection and the creation of social norms around those group identities, and that we can't ignore that. We have to deal, though, with what it is that we're really trying to analyze. So in the voter reapportionment cases, we're trying to analyze voting tendencies. In housing discrimination, we're trying to analyze a history of being excluded on the basis of race, not just racial identity qua racial identity. And so I might agree with you in the sense that, to the extent that racial designations are just arbitrary designations, that we might want to forget about them. And this is, I think we discussed this when you came out to USC. This is an argument that a lot of left scholars and activists made in South Africa. So it's an argument that I respect. But what we can't let go of is this way of thinking about historical set of experiences that were marked on the basis of racial identity that continue to have a very lasting impact. Okay.
I think we've reached a natural stopping point. It's been an animated and informative discussion. Thank you very much, Daria Roithmayr, for
I really enjoyed it, Glenn, and I'm very happy that we had a chance to do this.
Yeah, me too. Take care now.
All right, you take care. Bye-bye.